Hi everyone, this is Nick again. I'm going to talk today about how I went about writing my Project 1 assignment, and I'm going to go from my rough draft, which is what you see here, rough draft, okay? I'm going to go from there to I'm going to go a little further. I'm going to show you a bit about my final draft, and then let me see. I think it's the final draft that also has the flyer I created. Yeah. All right. So that's three parts: rough draft, a little bit about my final draft. I'm also going to talk about the flyer I made. And then at the beginning here, I want to do a little housekeeping about that's left over from the first video I made. That was about design elements and how I made the design choices I did for my multimodal portfolio in 105. Um, First part of housekeeping, trial and error. In office hours, this is what I kept repeating. Like I came to the design decisions that I did by way of a lot of trial and error, and that that kind of trial and error takes a lot of time. So that leads me into my next point. I think I mentioned it in this week's digest as well. Avoid planning bias. What is planning bias? Planning bias means that we as human beings, this is something we all do, we greatly underestimate how long it'll take to do a task. And the bigger the task is, the more off we are about how long that task will require. Um, it's something even Microsoft project managers take into account. If they're for projects, they automatically add in 30% more time. Um, so yeah, my suggestion when it comes to planning bias and planning in general for your assignments, allow more than enough time, like the time you think it'll take, and then some. Um, and you can go about that more accurately by breaking apart a big assignment like this Project 1 rough, full content rough draft, by breaking something like that into its parts like the actual writing and the flyer. You get the idea. Okay, so writing, and I'm going to begin talking about my Project 1 first draft by mentioning the last bit of housekeeping, why I skipped course learning outcomes in the first video I made. I skipped that because I went about including those, the WPA outcomes and habits of mind. I went about this by including them as parts of my different reflections. So I would, I have a way of going about things that if I can, like do a few things at once and, spare myself like starting over again in a different assignment, like writing about these or these, then I'm going to do that. And if I can tell a story better by doing that, I'll do that. Um, I realize there are many different ways of approaching even this one choice. And I'd like you to think about that because choices I talk about for my Project 1 rough draft, flyer, and final draft, like those are all choices that I made. Like I'm the only person really involved in those. I got some feedback, but they were my choices. You may make different choices based on what suits you as a writer. Um, so yes, first draft or rough draft rather for Project 1. So as you can see, my topic was living with fibromyalgia in Tucson, Arizona. So whereas you all have a specific group you're going to look into, a group of your choosing, my project was more about an issue in the community that I have a stake in. So I have fibromyalgia. It's something I've lived with for quite a while now. Don't want to date myself, so for quite a while. So we had a self-assessment. I think you have to do one as well for your rough draft. Maybe a little later on, I would look at that to check. And here's where I talk about my rough draft after I wrote it. And this may be worth reading. I had to leave out a lot of my first rough draft because one of my interview subjects, we had trouble lining things up, and so I had a less information. I had one fewer primary source to draw upon. So the structure of my rough draft, that was another issue that I found bothered me after I finished writing it. Um, and I say the structure of my rough draft for project one is so-so. That's because it is. The gap I mentioned here between the Tucson experience section and the possible solution section, it's part of that. How I addressed that in my final draft was imagining where my position is in relation to the issue, and where, what's the broader context in Tucson, Arizona for this issue that I've written about. And so I eventually kind of saw it as like something like concentric circles, and like I am at the center, of course, Nick having fibromyalgia, and then I thought about how my interview subjects also were living with fibromyalgia in Tucson, Arizona, and why there might be similar reasons that we all would experience such negative perceptions of both fibromyalgia and being a chronically ill person or a person living with chronic illness. So I kind of speculated why that might be, and that helped provide some context for talking about my experience of fibromyalgia. I talked about Tucson, how poverty is very common. 1 in 4 people here is living below poverty level. How education in Tucson, much like the rest of the state of Arizona, is not exactly a priority at the primary, secondary levels. So those bits of information help me create a scene and wherein my discussion takes place. And I'm a participant in that scene, and so are my interview subjects. And it's mentioned a little further on here. Let's get my abstract. I provide at the outset of my rough draft, I provide a more national level context for living with fibromyalgia, or being in the group, if you like to put it more in the terms of your assignment, being in the group of people who live with fibromyalgia. And then that skips right on over to what I talked about with Tucson. There's a gap. There are gaps, and that's totally natural to have some gaps in a rough draft. Here are some things that I've heard from other people when it comes to. I've been open about having fibromyalgia. And, both of my interview subjects heard these plenty of times. That's not a real condition. So it's a mix for me of statistics with secondary sources, and then firsthand quotes. Then I go to possible solutions, and that's where the gap comes in. And that's, like I said, it's natural. The gaps you have in your rough draft, your full content rough draft, will, of course, be different from mine. And of course, it's hard to miss big picture writing issues like structure. When you're, against the clock, sort of, when you've got 30 or 24 or 8 hours or 6 hours left to write a rough draft. It's easy to miss those. So I would go easy on myself if I were in that situation, easier on myself if I were in that situation again. Um, like it's just natural to miss things. It's also natural for in the process of receiving feedback from peers and maybe from Dr. Skeen, it's natural to have like great ideas come in or different ways of talking about great ideas you've already talked about in your rough draft. I think that part of the writing process, receiving feedback, considering it, uh, and then finding ways to integrate what's useful, uh, that helped me a lot in figuring out the big picture issues I was facing, such as structure. And there are my works referenced, like you're required to do. So here's my final draft, and I'm going to talk about this for only a few minutes here. It looks like the flyer is going to have to be its own little video, so I'm sorry about that. I'm limited to 15 minutes by the app that I'm using to screencast this. So again, like you can see, like compare this introduction, which is its own page and a somewhat long paragraph, to what came before. And you'll see that, I'm kind of rushing to hit my points, to hit the points I put in my outline. Okay, talk about how many people have fibro. Okay, talk about how the situation in Tucson with poverty and education might frame the issue of living with fibromyalgia. Okay, get to talking about primary evidence. Like I really rushed all those things, and that's part of what makes my final draft a better piece of writing is that I'm not in so much of a rush. Um, there is more consideration given. Even again, going back to what I commented on about still having errors in a finished portfolio that I think it got 100%. Like this is too much of a paragraph. I think just looking at it, I haven't read it. It's just blah 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 blah. Too long of a paragraph. Like there's definitely a way to break that up a bit to make things for me to make things easier on the reader. I actually added a lot more sections in my final draft, I believe, like diagnostic and criteria. I added some visuals. I didn't do such a good job of adding the within text visuals. And I think I also did a better job in my final draft of placing fibromyalgia within the context of generally having an invisible chronic illness and individual experiences. Once I got that second interview subject information in, like I was able to say a lot more about each person's experience and also in relation to my other points about poverty in Tucson, about education in Tucson, Arizona, and about some of the comments that I included above. These here. So I'm going to tie things up here. Breaking things into parts is beneficial as you work on. Pre-writing is really key. Being willing to rewrite your outline or whichever pre-writing you did for the rough draft, that's also key. This all requires a lot of openness and persistence and curiosity about what your peers have to say, what my peers have to say, and that's what like going further with those habits of mind as a writer, whether it's this assignment or another, is what helps improvement happen the most. Thank you very much.